The trade wars will create a massive drop in prosperity in the US. There is next to zero chance that the missions that they have declared will be successful, because the only way to get $2 trillion out of the budget would be to massively reduce the deficit and reduce defense spending. We're not reaching the upper end of LLM. The next large LLM that's trained with a larger computer will still have new magic in it. The scale game is still playing.
Ready to go? Reid, I am so excited for this. It's so special to have you in person again. Thank you for being here.
Always a pleasure. I look forward to this.
Now, listen, I know you have some news, so I'd love to just start with some of the news and let you start with that.
So, look, obviously, there's been a meme, because as I was talking about with my friends, that, obviously I am still extremely hopeful for American prosperity. I will remain living in Seattle, Washington as my residence. But when I was talking to friends, I said, look, I'd love to spend more time in the UK. That became a whole meme with the New York Times saying, he's moving. And it's like, no. I'm still based in Seattle, Washington. But of course, I come to the UK twice a year already anyway. And here I am.
And you thought, you know what, I'd love to see Harry two more times a year.
Yes, exactly.
I totally get it. My mother thinks the same.
By the way, I will commit here to being on air with you twice a year.
Sure, this is worth it already.
Yes.
Can I ask, how do you think about your future involvement in US politics? Like, just diving right in. You were very active last election cycle.
So look, I think one of the things that it's a responsibility of Americans to do, including myself, of course, is you try to make whatever administration as successful as possible for the people of America, for the country, for the industry. I will be doing that. I will be investing in businesses. I will be, kind of getting new American businesses generated. And so I will be doing those things. Obviously, in the next administration, they don't want to have me helping them, right? I won't be involved in any of the activity that the administration is doing. And actually, obviously, I anticipate, unfortunately, I'll probably be critical of some of the things the administration's doing. I hope to help do as many of the things that are like reduce regulation, increase energy for AI, have AI companies be prosperous for America and around the world. I will be doing all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, I suspect that I will have some things that I'm still an opponent of.
You said that you might be critical of some things. I'm critical of some things of this wonderful Labour government, everything that they do, bluntly. And someone said to me the other day, you should be a bit more careful. Some of your tweets might piss them off. Do you feel like you have the freedom and flexibility to be critical?
I do, because of the principles of America, which is we should aspire to continue to be a place where we can speak truth to power, that we can criticize when things are wrong, and I will continue to do that. Now, that being said, one of the things that I think is part of the reason why I have been critical of some of Trump's supporters and some of what Trump has done is because there is, even in the first administration, there were some abuses of instruments of state for personal gain, for personal power. And that is, I think, anti the spirit of anything in democracy, anti the spirit of anything in American. And so those are the things that I would still continue to be opposed to in as much as they play out. Now, my friends argue, no, that's just the electoral path, that when he talks about the fact that he is going to kind of attack enemies within or threaten to execute generals or other kinds of things, that's just politicking. That's not something that we will actually see. I am hopeful that they are right, and I am hopeful that we'll get back to the business of America, which is business.
Can I ask you said you're hopeful there. There's multiple different outcomes that can come. If you think like what could go very wrong with this administration and then what could actually go right, if we look on what could go wrong first?
So if the administration were to engage in a lot of idiosyncratic political persecution, whether it's individuals, politicians, military figures, businesses that were attacked entirely for political reasons, and kind of the balance of politics versus legitimate reasons, right? Because sometimes people do bad things, whoever they are, and that's fine. But like that was the kind of cause of what's happening. That's, for example, I think one of the reasons why like this whole tariffs thing, which could be enormously destructive, is like, well, how do I apply tariffs idiosyncratically, like against my political opponents, but not for my political allies? It's kind of ways of happening. Economic corruption. What if foreign actors, Russia, others, were transferring economics to people with political power in order to influence the U.S. in what they're doing? Easy ways to do that are like, buy Truth Social stock. Easy ways to do that are buy Freedom Coin or currency, invest in businesses that, people who are, have a lot of political power, or then essentially payoffs. All of those things would be in the category of like disastrous things.
Can I ask, on the tariff side,
Yeah.
What would you do with tariffs? What is the right way to use them to benefit America?
Look, America benefits enormously from a global trade regime. We, the whole country gets a lot of economic prosperity, including things that support areas of the country that have more economic challenge. So you don't want to create trade wars. The trade wars will create a massive drop in prosperity in the U.S. and in other places. Now, that being said, there are places that either have, like, for example, take Iran, who are bad actors within the international context, or Russia, and that actually, in fact, are creating violence and war and chaos and, kind of in various countries around the world. And you use tariffs and other kinds of sanctions as a way to rein in that behavior. That's one zone. Another one is if you have countries that are behaving irresponsibly within the global economic system. And so, for example, with China, there's ways in which they slant the field so that they say, well, we can do economics in your country, but we can do business in your country, but you can't do business in our country. I think responding
social media. I mean.
Yes. So it's like, okay, if you're going to disallow our businesses to operate in your country, we can disallow your businesses in parallel to operate in our country, right? Just as an economic thing, as kind of nothing else for how to operate. And those kinds of things I think are useful. I think if for example, people are using labor camps to produce products, adding tariffs as a way of saying, we're not going to allow that to happen, that's another good use. But those are like specific things, not general mercantile warfare.
But how do you think about the Chinese car industry? You mentioned their kind of global tariffs. That's obviously one. They subsidize the Chinese car industry phenomenally so they can do incredibly cheap production.
Yes.
How do you think about that and the destruction that brings to European cars?
No, and that's precisely like one of the areas we say, look, you're behaving irresponsibly because you're actually, in fact, trying to destroy our industry in the short term so that you can then raise prices later and capture it. That is mercantile warfare. Responding to mercantile warfare is completely fine.
And so we should raise tariffs on.
Yes.
Totally get that. So if that's like concerns and what could go wrong, if we were to put on the optimistic hat, what could go right?
So I think a number of things. This is, I actually think the U.S. will be benefited by a substantial reduction in regulation because the kind of like for every new regulation you want to add, remove two as a way of kind of modernizing and refactoring versus just accreting. Some of that will be, AI, for example, an area that I'm committed to, passionate about, believe will be great for the world over time. We'll need power. How do you get that power what do you do with regulatory? A return to nuclear power, fission and fusion, I think will be really amazing. I think the question around being deeply committed to growing business across the entire country, I think will be like really good. And like one of the things that I actually think is not only a competence but a moral requirement for American presidents is to say business is good. Now you should invest in business across the entire industry, not just your own. So it's not just improve real estate, right, or improve Freedom Coin. It's do the entire thing, and I think that's really important. So I think all of those things are things that we could see as very good outcomes.
So many things I want to unpack there. We mentioned kind of AI. What does Elon's political ascendancy mean for the future of AI?
Well, it's a little unclear. It kind of depends on how he chooses to use his time and focus. So if his time and focus was, let's make sure that all of the kind of players in U.S. industry are greatly amplified, like availability of power and the creation of new data centers and power to do that, and that's across the entire industry. That would be an enormous boon. If the question around, okay, let's make sure that we are being rational about how we are willing to import talent, as we have done in the history of the U.S., to bring in talent that can work on this across the entire industry, that could be really good. If it was I want to make sure that we are inventing the future at the speed we need to be doing it, that's really good. Now the challenges would be what if he goes, no, the most important issue facing AI is woke AI, because we have this calling card, which means a whole bunch of different kind of, these people are evil and terrible. That's silly, right? And not good, but easy to fix and not the most important issue when you consider what like AI means for American prosperity, well-being, a bunch of other things. Like that's an easy fix.
Do you think DOGE will be successful?
In a sense, I would want it to be, because I think the refactoring of bureaucracy, the refactoring of efficiency, those are things that I think accurately have gone wrong. I think there is next to zero chance that the missions that they have declared will be successful, because when you look at, like, the only way to get $2 trillion out of the budget would be to massively reduce the deficit and reduce defense spending. Those are the two areas where, or for example, Medicare, right? Social Security. Those are the areas where the real money is for this. Like, we want to posture that it's that we just have too many federal employees. And by the way, maybe we do have too many federal employees, but it's not where the trillions of dollars in terms of what you can cut out of the budget. That's not actually where you can get it.
Did you see the news though of, like, we don't actually know where your taxes go? Well,
that's generally true for very large financial institutions. And by the way, I think it's an important thing to, like, that's the reason why, like you say, bull bear case on DOGE as well. You go, look, I actually think kind of going through, balancing the books, figuring out the economics, applying kind of fiscal discipline in the way that we do in companies is a very good thing. What I think is a false promise is to say, well, the really important thing is if we lay off X percentage of the federal workforce, then all of a sudden our federal budget will be so much more trim. It's like, well, no, actually you just have to do the math, and that's actually not where the numbers that you're claiming you'll get to is.
What do you think should happen to defense spending? In Europe, we spend woeful amounts on defense. And, I've got Torsten from Helsing coming out tomorrow's show.
Yes.
He wants bluntly it to be 5-6%, and it's 2%.
Yeah.
What should happen to U.S. defense spending?
So I think U.S. defense spending should reduce, right? I think that would actually be a good thing. It's one of the problems that we have in American politics, and that we have neither the political will to do that on either the left or the right side. Like, if I anticipate anything going to be happening in the next administration, it will be increase in defense spending versus decrease, despite all we're going to have fiscal discipline and we're going to reduce costs and we're going to bring this, a massive amount of that comes from the Department of Defense. And the way that I would do it is I would try to, because basically, if the business America's business, it's you want to be investing in things that create the future businesses. The military-industrial complex is not the business that you most want to be investing in. And so how do you essentially do that?
Do you think you can reduce defense budgets so when you have the global conflicts that we have today?
Yes, right. I mean, it's not, we spend, like, if you said, where should DOGE focus? The answer is, actually, in fact, there's a lot of massive misspending within the Department of Defense. Now, part of that is not just the Department of Defense's fault. Let's take a specific. We should not be building aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers themselves cost billions. The planes on them are more billions. They put, thousands of American lives on them. And in the modern world, you have to, sure, an aircraft carrier is great for bullying Sudan, right? Which is not a particularly good use of billions of dollars in military. In a real conflict, one or two hypersonic missiles, which are like $2 million each, can take out an aircraft carrier. So if you said, what should I be doing to save money in American defense? It's like, let's stop building aircraft carriers. But of course, part of the political reason that doesn't happen is because the states and Congress people, one of the things that happens frequently is the Department of Defense says, well, we should stop these programs. And Congress says, no, we're continuing them because this is where, you're spending money in our district is. And that's the kind of thing that if DOGE had guts, they would go to, right? But, that's a difficult political target.
Very difficult. Do you think the US should continue to subsidize the lack of spending that Europe commits to in defense?
I think, yes. I think it's better for the world and better for Europe if Europe increases its defense spending. Now, I understand it was the right thing after World War II and the right thing with the Marshall Plan and the right thing to create interdependence to do that because you wanted to make sure that in this area that created two world wars, that you created strength of ties and bonds. It's part of what the European Union's about, trade, mutual prosperity. But now that that's there, I think it's good for Europe to get to its rightful place, both in, for example, like defense against terrible players like Russia and things, but also in the world to be another important force in the world, and that means increasing the defense spending.
And that includes Ukraine?
Yeah. Look, my view is that the Ukrainian people have the right to fight for their own self-defense, and that it is a good thing in the modern world order to defend people who are defending their own children, their own, families, their own, against genocide. And it is not for us to say, oh, Ukraine was always just part of Russia. That's for the Ukrainians to say, not for us. That's enormously, that's kind of like, that's a repetition of evils that human beings frequently do. You should be clear about this, and people have a right to articulate their own self-determination. I think supporting them in that is, I think, a good thing.
Can I ask, you mentioned Medicare. What would you like to see happen with Medicare, and what would be the right next 12 to 24 months?
Well, it's another area that's a political third rail in the U.S. because older people vote at much higher percentages. And so therefore, figuring out how to, for example, again, if you said, if DOGE had guts, they'd go look at this area to say, well, how should we rationalize this on a cost per quality, month of life? And you go, well, look, there's a whole bunch of money that's spent on these last 3 to 6 months of life. Let's reduce the spending on that and say that is not a public expense. And let's increase, for example, preventative and other things that are much more dollar focused. Now, again, unfortunately, I would predict that they're not going to do that because it's a political third rail and it requires, courage and other things to go into it.
You mentioned that the propensity for older people to vote, completely obviously true. What Trump did well was harnessing actually TikTok and younger people to vote. I'm intrigued. We mentioned, BYD and Chinese car imports. Should TikTok be banned on the back of this?
The right way, I think, to think about this from an American or any other perspective is to say China bans competition in China from Meta, Twitter, etc. And so the right way to say is look, if you're banning our companies, we should ban yours. Entirely a commercial question, not a question around, well, that's a Chinese social media company. Because I actually believe that there's a different question when you say, well, what should be the rules of governance for social media companies when you get around the world? And I think there should be, some transparency, responsiveness to local laws, et cetera. But I think that's the right thing to do. Now,
is it a bit childish? I don't mean that rudely, but it's like, well, if a child gets hit at school, it's like the parents saying, well, hit them back harder. So not really the right response, is it?
Well, look, I think it's a question of, it gets back to the tariffs question, which is you want people to be playing on a fair and balanced playing field. And so if you're denying, country X is denying licenses to country Y, then country Y should do that to country X, right? As just a general thing to get back to a playing field. It's not, and by the way, there's lots of bad actors in the world. So yes, sometimes, by the way, when the bully hits you, the only way to stop the bully from hitting you again or hitting someone else is to hit them back pretty hard, right? Because then they learn, oh, there's consequences, right? So it's like sometimes the rule of the 5-year-old playing ground is actually, in fact, the rule that countries live by.
We mentioned power and nuclear. There's a lot of opinions around it. How realistic is it to see the transition to nuclear power is needed or beneficial?
So this is maybe my greatest hope out of a administration that promises to be a wrecking ball to a history of regulation, because the things that we have done in regulating nuclear have been destructive to, for example, climate change, because you're using a lot more coal versus nuclear. I mean, we see great examples in France as how to use nuclear well. The technology has advanced over the decades in nuclear fission. People have invented nuclear fission plants that are powered. It's TerraPower, called TerraPower, powered on nuclear waste. So it's a way of consuming the waste and getting rid of it and converting it into power. There's all of these things that are really, really good to do. And a regulatory agency, backed up by fearful public opinion, unknowledgeable, ignorant public opinion, but fearful too, hasn't done anything about this. And you say, well, what's the best way? We're worried about running out of electricity. We're worried especially about green electricity, going and doing this. And so I myself have been investing in both fission and fusion over the last, 5 to 10 years, entirely philanthropically. I have no idea how to invest in this when I do these investments, I write them to zero in my book. I have no idea what the economic outcomes are of this, unlike internet investing or software investing, or what's the rational way of doing it, but creating the technology for the benefit of society and humanity is extremely important. So I've been putting lots of money into this out of a desire for making, putting America in a much better position, helping the world with this new technology, et cetera.
Do you worry that with AI, with global conflict, with everything that we see today, climate kind of just falls down the pecking order?
I think it's guaranteed, unfortunately. And given that it is an inevitable, it's a physics process, I worry about that. That's one of the, I think, likely outcomes of the next administration that will be a serious impact. Now, that being said, like you said, okay, bull bear on the next administration, they'll go, oh no, as they've said, climate change is a fiction and it's a liberal conspiracy and and you're like, why would the liberals bother with a climate change conspiracy? I mean, it's just the logic of this is not great. What they might do, which I would be hopeful for, is they say, look, what we really need to be doing is doing the Apollo projects on the right kinds of clean energy, and we're gonna now go 10x down onto that, including for all versions of nuclear as well as everything else. And that actually might have a very positive impact over time in what we're doing with climate change.
Does AI do more to help or to hurt climate change?
Well, it's a frequent misconception because there's obviously a growth of a electricity curve that AI has got climate impact. One, it's something like data centers, I think, are something like, it's some single-digit percentage of all power consumption, like 3 something. So it's not very big. And then AI within data centers is like, a single-digit percentage of that. So currently, AI is not accounting for any of the electricity that makes any of the difference. Now, but it's growing, and you go, well, what happens if it continues to grow in a compounding way, and so forth? So everyone goes, I can be green in climate by posturing in the media by saying, AI is bad for climate. Pay attention to me, please. Pay attention to me, please. And actually, in fact, this is a little bit like the people who are being anti-nuclear, which then caused a whole bunch of coal plants to be built, which caused a whole bunch of environmental degradation as a consequence of being anti-nuclear. It's a similar thing because AI has several points of being massively positive on climate. Here's a simple actual data point. So Google's engineers, some of the best in the world at running data centers, thought we have run our data centers as efficiently as possible. It was, I think, 5, 7, 8 years ago, DeepMind ran their algorithms on Google's data centers and figured out how to save 15% of the electricity. So think about you're applying AI and intelligence to go, how do we run our grids more efficiently? How do we apportion costs? How do we do all this stuff? How do we add intelligence to all this? That's one. Two, maybe even more significant, which, by the way, that means AI technology can actually be a net energy saver as we apply it to the inference cost to all the electricity we're doing in the future. Number two is, well, what's happening as a boon for green energy right now? All of the major hyperscalers are doing multi-billion-dollar commitments to green energy companies saying, if you can deliver the energy, we will pay you, we will give you the initial customer capital to build that. And by the way, we will subsidize, because energy is always expensive when it's small and cheaper as it gets bigger. We will pay the expense at the beginning to start building your nuclear, to build your geothermal, to build your, in order to do that. So they are functioning as the R&D venture capital for creating green energy for the entire society in building their new data centers. So that's another thing where AI is coming out to building green energy. And then, look, the most far-fetched and unclear is...
We love far-fetched.
But it's also possible, but I think this is more of a science fiction thing, is, well, the patterns of intelligence and AI, and people are doing this work, like applying it to, can we get it to make fusion to work? Can it solve certain problems that then make sustainable green energy possible because of the intelligence that AI can bring in its massive computation to solving these problems? And people are working on that, on fusion containment, right? Because if you can make fusion work, you can solve climate change.
Can you just unpack that for me? Sorry, I'm very naive. I'm a pure venture investor,
yes.
So not nearly as intellectual. How does fusion completely solve climate change?
So fusion is the most scalable green energy with, the sun is powered by fusion. And obviously there's various ways to try to use solar that I don't think we've tapped out on, and everything from satellites with solar energy collection to various things on the ground. So I think there's a bunch of stuff there. That's actually, in a sense, an indirect fusion, because you have this massive fusion reactor that's known as the sun. But microfusion is both super safe and can produce enormous amounts of power very cheaply. And once you have enormous amounts of power, you can solve significant world crises. So for example, how do you do decarbonization? How do you pull carbon out of the atmosphere in order to reduce global temperature back to that great band that humanity prospers in? And the answer is, it takes a lot of energy. well, if your energy is carbon producing as you're doing it, and then you're not net doing it, so you have to be carbon, neutral to negative on this. Then if you can produce it at massive scale, you can pull carbon out of the energy, let alone power all of the things that human beings want, like houses and transport and all the rest. So it's more than the silver bullet. It's like the platinum bullet.
I love a platinum bullet. Thank you for explaining that, by the way. I've learned one thing: never be afraid to ask the really basic questions. You mentioned there actually DeepMind and what you did with efficiency within data centers. How important was Willow, Google's announcement on their new quantum chips yesterday?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a significant step forward. Look, I still think, I don't know exactly where we will be in scale quantum computing. I think usually, again, of course, the discourse with new technology always starts with the fears, which is a mistake that I'm always trying to correct, because it doesn't mean you shouldn't have concerns and anxieties and navigate. But like, for example, you go, oh my God, quantum computing, it's going to break security, and our banking system is going to collapse, and our public, encryption and security safety is going to collapse, and oh my God, there's a disaster. You're like, well, look, we'll have to figure that out, because that'll be an issue once we get to what is, somewhere maybe minimum 2,000 or 5,000 logical quantum bits, qubits. So that's at 2,000 to 5,000 or more is when you get into the encryption issues. At call it 150 to 250 logical qubits, so a complete order of magnitude down, quantum computers become great at helping invent new medicines, new drugs, new semiconductors, new physical materials, things at a micro scale. That's going to be the first thing from quantum computing. So the moment that we can get there, it'll have enormous prosperity benefits well before we have to navigate these things. And so I'm very hopeful about quantum computing. I just don't know the time frame.
Speaking of kind of immense power, one thing that did just strike me that kind of worried me is like, I don't think we've ever seen someone with as much power as Elon has. He owns the digital town hall. He owns the roads around the town hall with Tesla. He owns the power for it with Starlink. He kind of owns the physical town hall now with ownership of, Donald. Have we ever had someone with so much power, and is that not worrying?
I think we have had people with that much power in history, but I think part of modern society is to create checks and balances, to create accountability within your government. So like, for example, traditionally when you have people who go into government, they put their business stuff in blind trust and do other things in order to avoid conflicts of interest. So I think the worry is not necessarily the power as much as the conflicts of interest, and navigating the conflicts of interest with, kind of ethics and integrity, which I think is the thing to watch with the next administration. The power, look, I think that Elon is
he's able to turn off the internet for large swathes of the population.
Yeah, look, and so I think we want that to be within the hands of democratically elected governments, right? Or at least certain parts of it, and I think that's important. But by the way, I think while there are things that I have been and probably will be in the future critical of Elon about, the electric vehicle revolution owes itself to Elon. The revolution in space ISPs with Starlink owes itself to Elon. And by the way, the initial defense of Ukraine would not have worked without Starlink. So there's enormous positive contributions here. So it's a complicated topic. Now that being said, I would want the kind of halls of democracy and government and the conflicts of interest within personal businesses to be kept very distinct. And I think we may see some challenge in that.
What do you think is his greatest power and his greatest weakness?
Well, they actually kind of go together. Elon has a conviction that what he believes is true is absolutely true, even when all of the evidence is against his belief, right? And so that allows him to do, I can see that we can colonize Mars, and here we go, right? And that creates, SpaceX, that creates Starlink, that creates, and so huge amount of kudos and power. But then that similarly, when he sees a conspiracy theory on Twitter that's probably being created by Russian intelligent assets to destabilize the U.S., he goes, "Oh, that looks right to me," and then he'll retweet it, right? Because that's correct. And so it's the same impulse which has created these amazing things, but also has these destructive things.
Should one not have policing on tweets? I had this debate before with many American guests, and I'm like, that can be very dangerous and damaging to have someone retweet with his power and weight to the audience that he does. And my American friends are like, of course not. It's freedom of speech. You should be entitled to.
The importance of freedom of speech, there's a really interesting distinction between freedom of speech and freedom of reach, right? So if you're standing at the local corner and standing on a soapbox and saying the moon is made out of blue cheese and the earth is flat and so forth, well, that's fine, go ahead, right? Right. When we have our collective media systems, e.g. reach, it's important to have some ability to say, well, we should bring in studies and expertise into it. And by the way, this is what we've made progress with science. This is how we've made progress with law, is we use thoughtful groups of people to bring a notion of truth. So in science, it's reproducibility of science experience. It's scientific panels which decide on things being, advocated as true. In juries, you have in the U.S. 12 people who listen to it and have to agree. We have blue ribbon commissions. That's the way we do things. And so we need to kind of figure out how to apply that also within, call it the reach.
So should there be policing? Because I mean, he is not an ambassador for the UK, to say the least.
Yes.
And some of the stuff that he retweets is true.
Yes.
And some is completely not true.
Yes.
And people believe it. So should there be policing on that?
Look, if I could, through a democratic process, because I believe in democracies, I believe in collective governance, get our society to agree to say, hey, what we should do is identify some topics that panels of experts can yield to a truth determination on. I would prefer we do with all media. And by the way, it's not just social media. It's also cable news. It's also talk radio. We say, look, if you're going to speak your opinion, which you may do, you can say the world is flat. I can get on Harry's podcast and go, I believe the world is flat. And then what you say is, oh, by the way, expert opinion says that's completely false. And just along with my saying the world is flat, expert opinion comes up and says, hey, by the way, if you're listening to this, you should also consider that expert opinion says this is totally false, right? And so it allows you freedom of speech, but it then allows a collective learning system in the system. I would prefer that, but we need to get there through a democratic process.
Frankly, one of the things that he said, which is dangerous and the reach is worrying, people said in comments when I asked, is about Epstein.
Yeah.
Why is that wrong?
I was never a client of Jeffrey Epstein's. I never had anything directly to do with Epstein. Everything I did was fundraising for MIT, right? Which my mistake, which I publicly apologized for, is I relied on MIT's vetting to say, hey, we vetted him and it's okay to do this. I obviously regret that. I've issued an apology about burnishing brands because, the damage to victims and other kinds of things. But of course, the modern age is such that these things get reported and so then have a media impulse. So you have to be responsive to that.
Do you not worry, though, about that cancel culture and that freedom of ability to just destroy someone's, be so wrong and lie when you have a reach like Tucker Carlson and you can just say what you want and now, fuck it, someone else said it. That's a really worrying world.
Yes, exactly. And the funny thing is the right wing says woke is cancel culture, and yet that's the shit they do. It's of course enormously destructive. I'm very careful about the things I say. I only say them when I have, some ground for evidence that I can speak publicly to, that I can have other people validate why it is I'm saying it, right? That kind of thing. That's the standard that we should all hold ourselves to.
Matt Clifford told me about a couple of different areas where you're spending time. He told me one is AI applied to cancer. Talk to me about your work with AI, how that interacts with cancer, and how our interaction with cancer will change moving forward, do you think?
So one of the things, in addition to quantum computing, which we already talked about, one of the things that I've been looking at is what other areas are people not paying nearly enough attention to that AI will make a huge difference for the human condition. And drug discovery is a really important one. And how you use drug discovery as we invent new drugs for really key things like cancer, those will make a huge difference to the quality of human life, to lives saved, and to the economics. So we spend an enormous amount of our economic budget on medicine, and we'll have a huge saving there. So I've been looking into that. I serve on the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative BioHub. I serve on the ARC Institute board. I've been working on the intersection of bio and computing for over a decade now. And I think now is the time with AI that we'll start seeing amazing new products.
Do you think, I was thinking this last night when I was kind of reading into this, do you think that if you are a serial entrepreneur building in AI today, doing a SDR tool for sales teams, you are doing yourself an injustice? When you look, and I know that's a bold statement, but when you look at cancer, climate change, poverty, conflict, defense, and you are choosing to spend your time on SDR work, I think it was the Founders Fund guys who said it was like an injustice if you do that.
I think that's a hyperbolic statement. I mean, look, I think we want to get more people doing the big things, doing nuclear fission and fusion, doing drug discovery, doing education, doing other things that have an impact for billions. But by the way, sales process is also part of how the OS of our society is business. The OS of our society is like, how is government funded? Through the operations of business. How are universities funded? How is medicine funded? How is education funded? Through the operations of business. So improvement of business is a good thing. So improvement of sales and sales efficiency is also a good thing. So is it a less heroic, like, oh my gosh, I have cured some versions of cancer. I have made fusion possible. Yes. And I think as a society, we should appropriately treat the people who are doing the heroes and things as heroes. But by the way, it's a contribution to be contributing to sales too.
On the flip side of that, when we think about spending more time in the UK, it's a very negative sentiment towards the UK now, forgetting Elon, but just generally. Why are you maybe bullish when everyone else is incredibly bearish?
Well, I'm bullish for a couple of reasons. So one, amazing set of talent, universities, technical talent, entrepreneurs, a willingness to be bold. Like, for example, when you, not just the bold that went and created the United States of America, because you could look at U.S. as a entrepreneurial offshoot from, Great Britain, but also, kind of a global perspective, a willingness to be like one of the things that I loved in my visits here and my days as a student was, the global learnings and global perspective I get from, London and Oxford and Cambridge and other places. And so I think that there is enormous potential.
How do you think about that, though, in the face of, bluntly, the deterioration of the German ecosystem, the no growth for the UK for 3 consecutive years, as our wonderful Labour government have pointed out? Like, it doesn't look good. I'm trying to be able to, my business is here, my fund is here.
Look, it doesn't mean there aren't challenges. Maybe I can say this as an American. Brexit was a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Right? And I think there are challenges. But the notion of how we rejuvenate economies, we go, look, how do we build the economies of the future? And so you can't try to hold on to the economies of the past. You don't want to say, well, I want to be doing coal mining in Newcastle. You're like, no, right? We should be good for those communities and people and try to help them transition, but we need to build the economies of the future. And so the question is I think the UK is well positioned to make that progress and make that effort, but it has to be collectively investing in it, enabling it, bringing in talent.
Do you think we are? Because like when you think about chip sovereignty, energy sovereignty, bluntly economic distributions across the country, I cannot point to one positive around any of them.
You may have studied this more closely than I have, and so there may not be yet, but I know that the capabilities, the talent, the will is possible. Now we just have to organize and make it happen. I mean, this is part of the thing of, occasionally, since, as part of my support for Entrepreneur First, I meet with these entrepreneurs. They're great entrepreneurs, right? They can create great businesses. We need to enable that. And by the way, once you create great businesses, that then has economy, jobs, revenue, tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. That's the thing we need to be doing.
Do we need chip sovereignty and Europe's ability to have our own Nvidias of the world? Does the US, how do we think about TSMC?
So I think it's important to have chip sovereignty within, call it, the Western ecosystem. So whether or not, like, for example, I would be less concerned, like I'm an advocate for, I think what the Biden administration did with the CHIPS Act is a good idea. I think that, trying to restart the CHIPS ecosystem in the US is a very good idea. I hope that while I expect that the next administration, because they'll say everything the Biden administration did was terrible, we're tearing it all down, that they'll tear it down in words and then keep doing the work, right, would be my hope. But I would be much less concerned about that if Europe had a good chips industry, because it's within the Western ecosystem and it's diversified. Like one of the things we learned from COVID is one of the challenges of globalization tends to be we resolve to one point of manufacture, but then you're brittle. So when Italy went down with COVID, all of a sudden the specific kind of medical manufacturer that was oriented there suddenly broke for the rest of the world. So you want several different places of source of origin for resilience and robustness against possible adversity. And so ideally, in a good world, you'd have 2 to 4 or 5 places of semiconductor manufacture, and you would have at least 1 or 2 of those within the Western nations. And if that was the case, then we'd be good. So a single point of dependency on Taiwan has a bunch of global risk.
Do you think Nvidia continues to accrue power and monopolization or monopolies? Or do you think it continues to be eaten away by Apple's, Google's, Amazon's building more and more of their own chip supply and ability?
So unsurprising to you, because you and I have talked a bunch, both, right? So both. Nvidia's business will continue to go very strongly because they have an amazing lead currently in amazing chips, and there is massive demand for their chips for doing compute. And many players, Google, Amazon, others, including AMD, are building out chips as well. So you both have them developing what is still a very valuable leading resource and a bunch of other chips developing as well. We have kind of like electricity, we have infinite demand for compute at kind of, call it moderate pricing. So as long as we can deliver that, demand will completely fill.
In terms of like demand, we have multiple different LLM providers. We had Mark Benioff on the show, and he said, I'm not going to do his accent actually, it's going to be terrible. We're reaching kind of the upper end of LLM abilities. Yes. But now we're moving...
By the way, incorrect, but yes. We're not reaching the upper end of LLM. Look, it's kind of like, look, the press cycles like to go, aha, we haven't seen anything in the last 6 months. We're at the upper end. It's like, oh, if it were, we haven't seen anything. By the way, we did see GPT 01, right? If we hadn't seen anything in the last couple months, that doesn't mean it's the end of the cycle. That means we're still getting to what the next set of exciting things. I think the next larger computer, the next large LLM that's trained with a larger computer will still have new magic in it. And all of the people who argue against it are, to some degree, arguing their own book. Well, I don't have the compute, so the next level of compute won't make a difference. I don't have the data, so the next level of data won't make the next difference. Or the current data is all we have, and so we won't be able to do it. It's like, well, actually, in fact, we can create synthetic data, and there's a ton of data that's out there that's not part of the standard internet training corpus. So the scale game is still playing.
So he was saying we've reached the upper end of LLM.
Yes, incorrect.
And then now it's the era of agents.
Yeah.
And that is why agent forces.
Well, by the way, he's right that, look, we're going to have a ton of agents, and I think the agents will be composed of multiple models, but to count out the next level of scale models as being important in creating a number of quality agents is just incorrect.
Do you worry when you look at the pricing of some of the investments going down today that it's just a complete bubble?
Well, so when everyone understands that a technology transformation is happening, a bunch of people make foolish investments. It happened in the internet, it happened in mobile, right? It happens. But because there's some foolish investments doesn't mean there aren't also really good investments that change. And so part of the work for being a good investor is to, on a probability basis, because you will make some foolish investments too, to make sure that you have some of the really good ones. And so, and by the way, sometimes the decision of foolish or wise is doing something that may seem like it's a crazy price.
What deal did you do that seemed like a crazy price was a phenomenal investment?
Well, when I did the Series A of Airbnb,
what was the price?
60 million post. At that time, the founders probably could have gotten on the phone all week and called every single person who had used an Airbnb that week if they were working through the call list.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very small transactional volume, right? And the question is, would it grow? What would happen with cities? What would happen with market acceptance? There's a bunch of other things. But part of the way that I invest is I go, well, look, if I'm right, if the theory of this investment is correct, then it will transform an industry. And that's what I tend to do as an investor. It's majority of my investments, not all, there's sometimes other things. But if that plays out to be the case, and so then is my theory of my investment at least a reasonable probability, right? Like it has a reasonable chance of working. And that's why I did the Airbnb one. So that would be one example. I'm sure there's others as I would think about it. But I also tend to be more careful about like part of the discipline that I've learned from Silicon Valley is when you look at a seed, a Series A, a Series B, you go, okay, is this, it isn't that price is irrelevant. Does the coherent sense of this make sense in terms of what future capital will need, how the entrepreneurs are thinking about their business? And so that's part of where pricing comes in.
Do you think acqui-hires are inevitable for LLM companies? We see the likes of Mistral in France. They just don't have enough cash. I mean, it's spade to spade. Are acqui-hires inevitable?
I would, in a well-functioning society, hopefully it's acquisitions rather than acqui-hires. Part of the thing that there's a thread of antitrust that misunderstands their own game. So, for example, the thread of antitrust roughly looks like this. It says, we should stop the aggregation of power in the large companies, so we should block acquisitions. And in some cases, limited specific cases, that makes sense. But in general, if you want competition with those large companies from startups, investors, say, for example, I'm an investor who's going to put $1 billion into a company that might compete with one of the large tech companies. I'm only going to put the $1 billion in if I have a chance of an acqui-hire, or not an acquisition exit, because I'm going to need the $1 billion back possibly. That's a huge loss. So if I am blocked, if you have a regulatory authority to say, we are never going to allow that, then I'm never going to do the investment that allows a company to potentially compete with those large tech companies. And so their theory, which is we're stopping the aggregation of big power, is they're creating more aggregation of big power because they're stopping the financing of competition.
Does the M&A window open up without Lina Khan?
Well, I hope so. And by the way, I think it's good for society. It's good for competition, right? Like it's good for investing in the competition. And so that's part of the reason why I've kind of made public statements around this, because it's not that I'm saying, oh, antitrust is bogus. I'm saying you actually got the exact wrong theory of the game.
Do you think Figma's antitrust was bogus?
Shortly. I mean, look, I'm an investor and all the rest, and I think Figma is an amazing company that's I'm probably going to make substantially more money because the deal was essentially derailed. But that was a bad theory of the case.
Yeah, well done, CMA.
Yes.
God. Listen, I would love to move into a quick fire. I always leave thinking, God, I've learned so much. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. What do you believe that most around you disbelieve?
What I think is that the AI revolution will both create enormous value for the large companies and enormous value for the small companies. And it's going to do both. And part of that is because I don't think it's a big tech question. I don't think it's a little tech question. I think it's a scale tech question. And I think part of what we do as investors and creators in new industry is we invest in scaling technology. It starts small and it gets very large, and we want more large tech companies. The answer is not we want fewer large tech companies. We want more large tech companies.
Is Twitter better post-Elon or worse?
With deep regret, I would say substantially worse.
What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail?
Well, fusion energy, maybe.
Very good answer. What's the highest multiple investment you've ever made?
Actually, almost never look at multiples. So
Do you not?
No. My investments are at 7 to 10 years out, and so it's a belief in what 7 to 10 years looks like. Right, and almost everything I invest in is unprofitable when I invest in. Have I invested in a business that's profitable? I can't remember.
What would you most like to change about venture today? You see the landscape very clearly.
Well, what I would love to have, and look, I understand the economics. I myself follow the economics of going into software, a broader range of things, and I've tried to do some of that myself, so I don't just preach it. A nuclear fission and fusion, a Joby, and kind of flying cars, because the world is not just digital, it's also real and physical. And so a broader range would be a good thing.
Tell me, what have you changed your mind on in the last 12 months?
Like a lot of the changes, part of the reason why it's taking me a little bit of time to answer this is a lot of the changes are micro changes. Like it's kind of the, what is the right way for governments to interface productively with cryptocurrency, right? And there's micro things. I'm a believer in cryptocurrency. I bought Bitcoin back in 2013. I've invested in cryptocurrency companies. I think it can be very good for society, but the way that it, the ways that it can integrate well in society, like there's evolving beliefs there, like what should happen, what should not happen, but they're all like micro things, not macro things. Maybe the most macro thing, it's not a change of my belief as much as it's kind of like an open question. I watched, and this is like the real, like I'm going to the totally crazy thing. So I'm not saying I believe in this, but I watched some congressional testimony from people from the national security establishment. Government labs were studying material from extraterrestrial spacecraft. And this was congressional testimony. And so I was like, huh? Right? Like, is it an asteroid, or is it a robot ship, or what? Like, or is there nothing? Is it just craziness? But before I'd watched that testimony, if you had said, what do I think about UAPs? The answer is conspiracy theory. And maybe that's still the right answer, but like I just watched that recently, and I'm now got to go scratch at that a little bit and say, okay, what is this UAP thing, and try to understand it.
What is the price of Bitcoin end of 25?
By the way, I never do like that again. 7 to 10 year horizon. So I bought a bunch of Bitcoin. I just hold it. Like I've never sold it, et cetera. And I then haven't bought new Bitcoin. I would say end of 25. So I'm approaching 200,000.
Okay. Let's do it. We're going to have another show at the end of 25. You mentioned Bitcoin. You mentioned Airbnb Series A. What was the worst financial investment you've made?
Well, actually, the interesting thing about this is people tend to think the worst thing you did was you invested in something and went to zero. Actually, in fact, the worst thing is saying no to the things that went to the moon.
Well, it's not doing the B of Airbnb and the C.
Yes, exactly. Like those kinds of things. It's the
What
putting.
one comes to mind with that?
Well, Airbnb was one. I mean, there was it's one. Look, where I have key lessons is where I have key lessons of missing an opportunity I should have said yes to. And I should have said, okay, look, I led the A, I don't need to go lead the B or the C. I should have gone, I'll lead the B or the C. I'll double down on the risk coefficient because I had the conviction. I just had look, I'm already in it. I already led the Series A, right? So that's clearly one. I got pitched early in Stripe and Square, and I didn't do the investments because I knew how hard payments was from PayPal. It's one of the things when you know too much and you know the risks too well, and those were terrible mistakes. I mean, there's just the list of things you missed that you regret is substantial.
Oh, for sure. When you're doing it right.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. Final one for you. You have had the most incredible career. When you think about advice given across it,
yes,
what's the best advice that you've ever been given that sticks with you most?
Well, lots. Like we could have a whole show on advice, but I'll say with one of the things my dad said to me when I was a kid, which is, he said the difficulty of making decisions is that in the short term, it reduces your opportunity set because you've made a decision, but it's the only way you have long-term opportunity.
I love that. And honestly, I have so enjoyed today. I can't thank you enough for going so broad with me across so many different topics. You've been fantastic. So thank you.
A pleasure as always. I look forward to my next trip to London.